Morning, everyone. Okay, I'm going to be talking on a much broader aspect compared to everyone else, and we're going to be looking at sea plan and an identification of focus areas for marine protected area expansion from plans to actions. South Africa has ratified the Convention of Biological Diversity, which commits the country, including KZN, to three main goals, and the main objective of this convention was to develop national strategies for conservation and the sustainable use of biodiversity. One of the outcomes of this was the National Protected Area Expansion Strategy, which set a number of targets for the land and marine areas, and these were 20-year targets with a target of 20% for the offshore area and 20% for our inshores, with 15% of this being required within a no-take marine protected area. If we look at the National Spatial Biodiversity Assessment, we can see that KZN is concerned with 5 bioregions. And if we look at the targets within these, we can see that although in the Delagoa bioregions our targets are met adequately, within the Natal bioregion and the offshore area, we are currently falling very far short of these. KZN, or Ezemvelo as the conservation organization, also reports to Outcome 10, and we currently have targets for 2013 of 8% and 3% required to be within a marine protected area by the state. One of the outcomes of the NPAS was to identify these protected area targets within the most efficient areas to conserve biodiversity. And the best way to do this is to develop a systematic conservation plan. This provides a spatial framework to assess the status of biodiversity protection and identifies priority areas for marine conservation in KZN. It helps us to develop a map of critical biodiversity areas and potential sites for new MPAs along our coastline. These are the steps of systematic conservation planning. I'm going to run through each of these very quickly and just give you an idea of what went into this conservation plan. The first is the mapping of biodiversity, setting conservation targets, looking at our threats, performing an assessment and gap analysis, running the conservation plan, and then the implementation. Just to reiterate, the planning domain is obviously the KZN waters, which stretch from the shoreline out to the exclusive economic zone, which is 200 nautical miles offshore. So it's a really large planning area, and not much is known, especially in these deep offshore areas. If we look at the features that were mapped, we have habitat, species, and processes, and we have a large number of features within each of these categories that were looked at. This is the largest part of a systematic conservation plan, and if you saw Jean's talk on Tuesday, she said that this conservation plan has taken us almost 10 years, with most of the time being taken up with this process. Just to reiterate that the data layers were gathered from experts, some of them were mapped in the field, and others were from student projects, and all of this data has to be verified and then put into the conservation plan. Next, we have to set biodiversity targets. These are the distribution of features and the amount we need to be conserved. For each of our features, we had a baseline target of 20%, and we had an adjustment target for specialized cases such as endemism, vulnerability, and rarity. These are very different to protected area targets. It is looking at how much of a feature you actually want conserved. The next is the mapping of our threats. We did this with experts to come up with a list of threats for the marine environment, and we did simple mapping first to identify exactly where these threats can occur according to the legislation, and then for others we were able to get intensity data so that we could come up with some intensity layers. In total we had 38 threats, 16 of these were mapped for intensity, and these are combined into an integrated cost layer which shows us the threats that are currently occurring in the marine environment and gives us an idea of the pressures and where they actually are contained. The next is looking at a biodiversity assessment. This is looking at the proportion of features that are actually achieving their biodiversity targets. When performing this assessment, it was noted that 10% of our offshore habitats, 25% of inshore, less than 5% of species, and 0% of our processes are actually conserved within a marine protected area. So there's a lot of features that currently are not being looked after. Lastly, this calls for the conservation plan in order to identify the priority areas where we need to actually achieve these targets. The Marine Conservation Plan is a two-tiered process. We did a C plan and a mark sand analysis, and this was to align our conservation planning outputs with the bioregional planning development guidelines, and in order to come up with our critical biodiversity areas map. From our C plan, we identify irreplaceable areas. These are areas where you cannot go elsewhere to conserve those targets, and so you need to have these within your plan. These are hardwired into our mark sand analysis, and out of this we come up with our CBA2, our critical biodiversity areas 2, and our critical biodiversity areas 3, which are the optimal areas to achieve targets. If we look at the outputs, this is the C plan analysis. If you look, there's not many totally irreplaceable sites along our coast. That's because the marine environment is very large and we do have a large amount of options. But the irreplaceable areas that were identified are then hardwired into mark sand. And if we look at the final conservation plan, this gives us an idea of the critical biodiversity areas for the KZN marine environment. These areas are then grouped into focus areas, given each a number, giving us an idea of where we should put our efforts into proclaiming new marine protected areas. In conjunction with the conservation plan, we've also had a large amount of stakeholder engagement. This involved a number of stakeholder workshops, informing people about the conservation plan and asking for their inputs into this plan. We had a number of proposed MPAs that were brought forward to us, and we sat with the stakeholders during this workshop and assessed them against the conservation plan. In 2011, we identified the following priorities, which were seen as priorities that could be taken forward as proposed MPAs. I'm not going to go into each of them, but just to note that most of these were actually put forward by stakeholders or members of civil society. And so this is just interactions and relationships that we're having to build with these people. Another thing that came out of this workshop was for us to develop a guideline document outlining the steps for the proclamation of these MPAs. The stakeholders needed to be able to understand exactly what they needed to do to take these MPAs forward. And so we put this document together with National so that they would know exactly what steps they had to follow. I'm now just going to look at a quick example, and this is Aliwal Shoal, and this is because this is our first MPA or proposed MPA that is actually going forward. If we look at Aliwal Shoal, it is currently a marine protected area. It was declared in 2004. It's 20 kilometers long, stretches 5 kilometers offshore, and consists of a restricted area over the Crown and Produce and a much larger controlled area. In the marine environment, we have this problem of zones. We have permissible and non-permissible activities within these different types of zones along our inside our MPAs. And currently, only a sanctuary and restricted zone, B1, can be seen as contributing to no-take targets. Within the other areas, there is resource use. And so we have this problem of trying to understand and trying to get the stakeholders to choose the correct zonation to try and meet biodiversity targets as well as to meet no-take protected area targets. If we look at the original proposal that was put together by the stakeholders, they proposed rezoning this area with a sanctuary zone inshore and a much larger B1 zone, which would prevent fishing in this area but would allow things such as scuba diving, so non-consumptive use. This proposal, as I said, was put forward by the stakeholders, which was Clansthal community, and they are obviously members of civil society, and they had to follow this list of the proposed, in that guideline document to try and develop this proposal. This far, they've established a task team, which has now been endorsed by Izimvelo. We're currently putting together an MOA with the Clansthal Conservancy to allow them to actually put this proposal together. and then they will present it to Izimvelo. And we're having to draft a letter to the Minister because our MPAs are declared nationally, and KZN Wildlife, as the provincial authority, would like to run the public consultation because this is within our current zone. So these are just things that we are having to deal with as we start to take these proposed MPAs forward. And as I said, this really is the first one, and so it is kind of getting us our footing as we try and deal with what we need to do to actually move forward with these things. In the last, if we look at the critical biodiversity area or the conservation plan, we can see that this area clearly comes up as a critical biodiversity area. We have a large number of offshore reefs which are existing here. We have very important spawning areas. And on the shoreline, if you look closely, there are 3 areas that come up, 2 of them over important estuaries and 1 of them over important rocky shore and sandy shore areas. So this is really a motivation to try and rezone this area. Now, in the last meetings that we've had with the Conservancy and the task team, it was decided that although rezoning was a good idea, if we wanted to actually extend this MPA, it would be a good idea to do it at the same time. Looking at the biodiversity information, we've decided that the best idea would be to extend this MPA offshore as well as further north. This would be helping to create one of our first offshore MPAs, and would be contributing substantially to our protected area and biodiversity targets. If we look at the original zonation, there was this larger shoreline sanctuary that was proposed, but on looking further at the zonation and the types of activities that occur in this area, we have now decided that the best idea would be to settle for a restricted or B1 area, which would include the Mashlongwana and Amashlongwana estuaries, and a small shoreline sanctuary, which would really act as our first benchmark area in the Natal biozone, allowing us to see what these shorelines and sandy shores would look like without having any resource use on them. Whereas the B1 area would be preventing fishing, but would still allow some consumptive use, which many of the members of this task team and people in this area are involved in. So this really is the point that we're at with this MPA. The next steps are for us to provide this data and for the task team to put this proposal together. It's then going to come to Izimvelo, and we will follow the legal process to try and get this proposal taken forward. And we hope that all the lessons learnt and bumps along the way will help us to take the rest of the MPAs or proposed MPAs forward more efficiently. And just to thank everyone, it is a very collaborative project, and to thank all of those that actually put time and effort into this, and many of our stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, it's working. Thanks. That was a very good presentation. Do you have any questions or comments to make to Tamsyn? Sheldon?
Tamsyn, I realize that Izimvelo's mandate is specific to KwaZulu-Natal, but in terms of national targets, in southern KwaZulu-Natal, adjacent to the Eastern Cape, you had quite a large area that was highlighted in your kind of priority areas map. Now, the fact that there is an existing large MPA across the border, the Ponderland MPA, is there going to be a broader kind of vision in terms of combining targets with that part of the Eastern Cape and KZN?
Yes, we have had a meeting already with the Eastern Cape, because we'd like to, instead of just mapping KZN, we'd obviously like to map the entire bioregion and then look at the targets for the bioregion as a whole, and we'd probably find that in that area the Ponderland MPA does take up a lot of them, and maybe we'd need to mop up some within KZN. But yes, we are working together with them and trying to get that going.